Our story today is found in 1 Samuel 14, and we'll begin in the previous chapter to get some context. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become an abomination to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel, with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical, and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. Jumping to verse 15, then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. So that is the introduction to our story. The context here is that the Israelites are in constant conflict with a neighboring nation called the Philistines. This conflict has lasted for years. We are told that at this time, a man named Saul is king in Israel. In fact, he is the very first king of Israel. And as king, he is expected to lead his people in battle, to protect the borders, to face the enemy. And Saul acts on this. We were told in verse 2 that he chose 3,000 men from Israel to be the fighting men in his army. 2,000 men go with King Saul, and the other 1,000 are allocated to be led by Prince Jonathan, Saul's eldest son and heir. And even within just these few verses we've read so far, the conflict with the Philistines is a roller coaster of events, wildly swinging from success to defeat. First, the Israelites successfully attack a Philistine outpost in Gibeah. The Israelites hear about this success, and more people come to join the efforts at Gilgal. But the Philistines respond by coming out to meet the Israelites. We're told they bring 3,000 chariots, one chariot for every fighting man in Saul's army. Besides so many soldiers, they are described as being like the sand on a beach. Now, when the Israelites see this, their previous confidence disappears. They are struck with fear, causing them to hide, seemingly in any place they can find, ranging from thickets to down the inside of wells. Some even cross the Jordan to escape. They don't want to fight anymore. Saul's troops are described as trembling with fear, and finally in verse 15 we're told Saul leaves Gilgal, the place he'd originally called people to come and join and rally to him to have further victory over the Philistines. But now his people are scattered. The momentum has died away, and when he now counts his men, only 600 of the 3,000 are left. Things are not looking good for the Israelites. Let's continue verse 16. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah in Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned towards Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, another towards Beth-horon, and the third towards the borderland, overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the wilderness. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plough points, mattocks, axes and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plough points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. So, let's unpack this a bit. In their discouragement, feeling certain they can't meet this huge army of the Philistines, Saul and his son Jonathan and the few fighting Israelite men who are left retreat and stay in a place called Gibeah. Meanwhile, we're told the vast Philistine army camps over here at Michmash. Now, since the Israelite army clearly won't meet the Philistines in a head-on fight on the battlefield, the Philistines send out raiding parties from their home base, their large encampment here in Michmash. They send out 3 raiding parties to go into Israelite land, one to Ophrah, one to Beth Horon, and a third to Zeboim. The purpose of these raiding parties was to gain more ground, pillage, take more land, set up garrisons, and in essence serve as a further incursion into Israelite territory. No point spending your entire army to do a job if you can take the land piece by piece. Notice here on the map just how far into Israelite land the Philistines are venturing. The extent of their incursion, and arguably their invasion, is considerable. The second noteworthy point here concerns the matter of weapons, or lack thereof. Verse 19, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, 'Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears.'" A blacksmith was a profession of working with metal. A blacksmith would be able to properly melt metal and fashion swords, tools, and other weapons. But it says not a single one is found in all of Israel. How on earth has that happened? Well, the Philistines had strategically carried off all the blacksmiths and torn down all the blacksmiths' shops and abolished the trade in the land of Israel, all in a move to keep the Israelites disarmed, saying otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. This signals to us further the severity of the Philistine oppression. The control they have over Israel is so extensive that they have made it so they can't even properly arm themselves. And it goes even deeper than that. Israelites have to go over to Philistia to make and sharpen not weapons, but plows, axes, sickles. What are these tools used for? Well, they're needed for farming. Verse 21 tells us that they even have to go over to their enemy's land to sharpen their farming tools, and they have to pay the enemy for it. Meaning, they are paying their enemy to be able to farm, in other words, to be able to grow food. They can't even feed themselves without the Philistines. Their survival is dependent on their enemies. And so here we have an Israelite army, terrified of facing their enemy in battle, and they aren't even properly armed, if armed at all. We're told that only King Saul and Prince Jonathan have swords. A truly dire situation indeed. Let's continue. Verse 23 tells us that from this huge camp of the Philistine army, a detachment is sent out to the pass at Michmash. Now this whole area around Michmash was a deeply hilly country with sheer and steep cliffs. We can see that even from pictures of the area today. This hill country is deeply cut with plunging canyons, and of course these significantly restrict traffic and accessibility to the ridges above the canyons, making passage difficult. With one exception, a certain broad avenue called the Pass, or the Pass at Michmash. This was a wide avenue which allowed easy passage through the hills and gorges. And so the Philistines, sending out a group from their main camp, are making their way deep into this Israelite territory using this pass. Once they find a strategically sound place, they will establish an outpost there, creating in essence a stronghold. Chapter 14 from verse 1. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah, under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez, and the other Seneh. One cliff stood to the north towards Michmash, the other to the south towards Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." So Prince Jonathan, son of King Saul, is also camped out in Gibeah with what is left of the meager Israelite fighting force. The Israelites and the Philistine outpost are divided by this difficult and steep hill country between them. But one day Jonathan says to his armor-bearer, "Let's go. Let's go over to the outpost the Philistines have on the other side." Jonathan proposes crossing over this area and taking them by surprise. And he shows his stealth skills by the fact that the crown prince is able to slip away undetected by 600 men. Let's take a moment to consider what Jonathan's idea entailed and what it could have sounded like to his armor-bearer. Number 1, let's go over to the enemy alone. So we're outnumbered by a lot. Number 2, let's do this without the king's knowledge, approval, or blessing, risking dire consequences for the both of us, but perhaps more for a servant than the king's son. Number 3, in order to actually get to this outpost unseen, Jonathan and his armor-bearer have to travel not down the pass of Michmash, where it's easy to move, but up and down these steep, impossible ravines. This means they can't move as quickly as they like. It may give them a slight advantage because the Philistines don't expect anyone to approach from there, but they're risking their lives by possibly slipping, having a fall, or being spotted. And even if they reach the outpost in one piece, they'll be tired from the climb and not in the best state to put up a fight if they have to. Point number 4. Because the Philistine outpost will be positioned on the top of the hill or plateau, it'll be on a higher ground, meaning anyone approaching is more likely to be spotted, and if they by some madness decide to actually attack the outpost, they will be charging it by climbing up a steep ravine. This will be at a clear disadvantage, ridiculously so. Everyone knows that he who has the high ground has the upper hand. And finally, the last and most glaring point. Between Jonathan and his armor-bearer, only one of them has a sword. Only one of them has an actual military weapon. You might say that the prince's armor-bearer has the most pointless job in all of Israel. The job of an armor-bearer was to carry weapons, extra swords, spears. He functioned as a sort of military golf caddy. He has to follow around the person he's serving in battle, and if the person he's carrying for needs another weapon or loses his sword, the armor-bearer is there, ready to hand it to him. But as we've been told, there are no blacksmiths in Israel, and the only ones who have swords are Saul and Jonathan. Jonathan's armor-bearer has no extra weapons to carry around for his prince. And Jonathan is asking his young armor-bearer to go with him to the enemy, and he'll be going without a weapon. He's being asked to potentially charge into battle unarmed. And on top of it all, Jonathan punctuates his idea by saying, "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Perhaps. That's not a word that inspires buckets of confidence. Perhaps the Lord might help us. We're going on the basis of a perhaps. How will the armor-bearer respond to all this? It feels easy to guess based on how the other fighting men have recently responded to the situation. The other men in the army who hid in bushes and down wells, and who were described as trembling with fear. But this is what the armor-bearer replies. "Do all you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." "I hear your idea, my prince. Do all you have in mind. Go ahead." This isn't a helpless servant saying to a master, "Well, I must obey you. If I must, I must, because you rule over me." His response is uttered with deep trust, loyalty, devotion, and passion. This person is a person who trusts his prince. "I am with you heart and soul." That is a fervent, sincere response. And so this secret mission is set into motion. Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So after the long and treacherous climbing, the situation is about to get even more absurd, because they're going to show themselves to the enemy. And that's what they do. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." It would appear that the Philistines know well how the Israelites previously hid in holes and thickets out of fear. Now, mocking them, they tell them to come up. So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. This again tells us just how steep this is. They're having to climb up on their hands and feet, not the way you want to be approaching your enemy in battle on all fours. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armour-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. We're not told exactly how the armour-bearer manages to fight, whether it be with stones, an Israelite type of martial arts, whether they are throwing the single sword back and forth between each other. But whatever their method, unbelievable is this charge of Jonathan and his armour-bearer. And this charge is about to have huge ripple effects. Verse 15. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. So a fear spreads not just to this one garrison, but to all the outposts and raiding parties towards Ophrah, Beth-horon, Zeboim, and all the way to the main army that is encamped at Michmash. God is sending them into a confusion, and we're told the ground was also shaking. With Jonathan's attack on this one outpost, God is multiplying that effect to all the Philistines. Now the commotion can be seen and is noticed all the way to where Saul is staying. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armour-bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Bethaven. Like a wave and a rallying force, victory begins to spread through this story for the Israelites. Saul and his men joined the fight. Hebrews who were in the Philistine camp were not told if they were captives or had allied themselves with the Philistines, but they come over and join the Israelites. And then all those who are hiding in the hill country, in thickets and down cisterns, come out and join. And so on that day the Lord saved Israel, and they are victorious in battle. What then shall we conclude about this story? And what is this narrative about? When I was attending university, I lived on campus in the dorms. This was a Christian college, and most of the students stayed on the campus or very close to it. And as has a tendency to happen when most of one's life is contained inside a small space like that, your friends, your studies, where you eat, the people you associate with, all being in that relatively contained area, the parameters of one's world can begin to shrink, become confined to that micro-world. One can become quite narrow in one's awareness of the world, losing sight of there being a greater population, a greater culture, different viewpoints outside those walls you live inside. And so this campus was sometimes affectionately referred to as one of this particular church denomination's ghettos. I was studying theology at the time, as was a majority of the other students, and there was a real irony in that we could sit all day in classrooms learning about the Bible, the gospel, ministry and mission, while yet having so little contact or even awareness of people who weren't us, weren't inside those walls, weren't also Christians or thought in the same way. But there was, thankfully, a few individuals here and there who had the discernment and awareness of what ministry actually means. That it has to stretch beyond the sameness and confines of a congregation, or in this case, a campus, and had to extend to actively building relationships and seeking the well-being of all people. There was a particular student who had a passion for the homeless. He wanted to actively pursue helping the homeless in the capital city of London, bringing them warm food, items they needed, and meeting them where they were, socially spending time and interacting with them. Now, this student approached the college. He asked them if they would like to get on board with what he was doing, to back up the project officially, or allow him to make it a larger program so that other students could sign up to it and once in a while go into London to bring services to the homeless there. The college turned him down and said they didn't want anything to do with it. Okay, but that didn't stop this guy. On his own time, he raised money, arranged for transport, invited others who wished to help out, and continued to facilitate this project. The point wasn't to convert anyone or gain new church members or preach at the homeless people. It was to bring relief to suffering and kindness to those in need. This homeless ministry ended up doing very well. More and more students hearing about it got involved. It became a regular thing, people volunteering to help, and these students were able to aid a number of London's homeless. The efforts of this guy and the rest of the students gained notice by other parts of the religious organization. There was an article or two in a church magazine, meaning publicity and public recognition. And it is at this point that the college administration approached this guy and they express a want to support his endeavors, to get behind the project and officially put the college stamp on it, so it could become a college-affiliated or run project, meaning all that good image, all that publicity that looked so good could reflect well on the college. But the college stipulated that with their involvement also meant that they could call some of the shots, make decisions, and in a sense take over the runnings of this ministry while also taking much credit for it. One of our students did this, in essence turning this homeless ministry into a promotional tool for the college to make it look good. Our guy wisely said no, and he carried on doing what he was doing to begin with. Now, over the next few months, the college would begin creating petty hindrances and interferences to his project, which he would continue to persist doing despite this. The story in 1 Samuel 13 and 14 is a story about two different kinds of leadership and the motivations which drive them. The story contrasts two people, the king and the prince. We've examined already what Jonathan's choices were, the risks he faced, the actions he took. Let's now take a second look, a closer look at the choices Saul made in this story. To do this, we're going to be looking at 3 scenes. The first scene we find in the beginning of chapter 14. So, following the Philistine army showing up and many of his fighting men running scared, this is what Saul does. Verse 2. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. So, this is our first scene. Saul's staying at Gibeah. You can see it here on the map. And the Philistine army is camped over here at Michmash in Israelite territory. In Israelite territory. Philistines are making incursions into the land, taking more territory, setting up outposts, and meanwhile the king, the leader of Israel, leader of the army, is doing what? Staying under a pomegranate tree. Staying, sitting, waiting. There's a couple of important details here to notice which are purposefully included in the Hebrew text. The first is the specific mention of the type of tree the king is staying under. Pomegranates were a highly symbolic fruit in Israelite culture. They were a metaphor for the richness of the promised land of Israel, symbolizing prosperity, abundance, fruitfulness. So much so that the garment hems of the priests who served in the tabernacle service were decorated with a depiction of pomegranates. And with that in mind, we discover that the author is painting a striking and pointed picture. This image of an enemy invading and stealing the promised land, the fruitful land God promised to give the Israelites, and meanwhile, the king is sitting under the very symbol of that abundance, watching it being taken away. The second thing to notice, we're told someone else is with Saul, a man called Ahijah. Ahijah was the grandson of Eli. Some of you may remember Eli as being the high priest at the time of the prophet Samuel's childhood. And now it is Eli's grandson, Ahijah, who is serving as a tabernacle priest, and he is the one in charge of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, when we're under threat, frightened or unsure, we tend to want to surround ourselves with anchors, things which can tip the balance in our favor, be they ever so small. Some people are highly superstitious in this way. Despite Serena Williams being considered one of the greatest tennis players of all time, she has a certain routine or superstition which she follows. Before each match, Serena feels the need to tie her shoes in exactly the same way, and has even commonly blamed losses on her not following this specific routine. Despite all her skill and resources and extreme talent, she does this. It is not uncommon for humans in various cultures to have objects of good luck, superstitious routines, or talismans. And what we're seeing here in chapter 14 is Saul certainly in a tense situation. In response, he is surrounding himself with whatever he can think of as being associated with God and God's power. Good luck pieces, or talismans, or ways to ensure God's help and presence and allegiance. It would be like someone today surrounding themselves with Bibles in a church while crossing himself incessantly. And again, the Hebrew text paints this rather cleverly. Because the king has sent for Ahijah, the tabernacle priest, the keeper of the Ark of the Covenant. Now Ahijah is not a soldier or a fighting man, so why is he there? Historically, it's not uncommon for military leaders and kings on battlefields to bring in a priest or religiously significant person, thought to bring some sort of blessing or good juju or assure God's help and ensure the chance of victory for their side. That is why Ahijah is there. This fact is underlined by the specific mention of what Ahijah is wearing in verse 3, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. Now the ephod was a specific type of garment, like an apron, worn by the high priest. This artifact was revered in ancient Israelite culture and closely connected with oracular practices and priestly ritual. Priests wore the ephod when conducting priestly business. And so Ahijah is brought in because of his priesthood, and he's wearing his work clothes in essence. He is there to perform a function as a priest in this setting. Additionally, he is specified as being in charge of the Ark of the Covenant. If you've joined us here at the house before, you may remember that we've talked about the Ark of the Covenant and what that was. It was a portable wooden box, in essence, which served as God's throne on earth, the place where he sat and where his presence was. And so on more than one occasion, the Israelites would carry the ark into battle with them, thinking they could pick the God of the universe up and carry him wherever they like, and if he was there, then surely they thought they would win. Again, a highly superstitious practice which didn't work well and led to much ruin and defeat in other stories. And perhaps Saul is here also involving Ahijah in case the ark needs to be used. Saul is hoping Ahijah's presence and the presence of the ark will bring change, bring blessing to this horrible situation. So that's our first scene. Saul's thinking and attitude is further revealed in the second scene we'll be looking at now. At this point in the story, Jonathan and his armor-bearer have attacked the garrison. We read how God multiplies their efforts into a ripple effect where all the Philistine outposts and even the main army is sent into a state of confusion and panic. And verse 16 told us, Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. In this scene, the Israelites are presented with a rare and unique window of opportunity. If the enemy army is in chaos and running away, what is the most reasonable thing to do? Well, to seize the chance at having the upper hand, you attack, of course. Any good commander will jump at the chance to find a kink in the armor, a weakness in the other side which can be exploited and result in victory. Now the Philistine army are literally running away in all directions. And what does the king of Israel do? Does he raise his sword, call to his men, and immediately pursue? No. The first thing he does is to command his forces to be counted. The king takes this opportunity to take a census, saying, "See who has left us. How many are we?" The second thing King Saul does is to say to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." Now, we're not told if the ark is actually there or if Ahijah needs to travel to Shiloh to retrieve it. Meanwhile, in the background, over in the Philistine camp, the tumult and chaos is increasing more and more. And only when this happens does Saul say to the priest, "Never mind, withdraw your hand." And then he assembles his men and charges into battle. Saul has literally had to do nothing for the defeat of Israel's enemies to take place. It is being served up to him on a silver platter. God is the one sending them into confusion. And Saul is running around like a headless chicken from one thing to the next, checking and rechecking to make sure the conditions are perfect, counting his men, looking for symbols of faith, weighing the risks. If you do, or have in the past, felt anxiety while shopping, you may have experienced counting your money over and over. Even though you know you've checked and double-checked that you have the right amount in your pocket for what you intend to purchase, you still can obsessively count the coins with your fingers, feeling the fear of having made a mistake or not having enough. Similarly, Saul is acting in a deeply insecure way here. Even as the enemy is self-destructing in the background, louder and louder, he still wants to count how many men are left. He still wants to take time to bring the ark there. Do we have all the magical pieces that we need to do this? And verse 19 said, "While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult of the Philistine camp increased more and more." Saul is still talking, still waiting, still hesitating, ruminating. It's almost as though God increases the panic in the enemy camp to signal to the king, "Come on, let's go. I guarantee you I've already got this. Come be part of the thing that I'm already doing. Come be part of the victory I've already handed you." And this leads us to the third scene with King Saul, which we'll look at now. And this scene takes us all the way back to the beginning of chapter 13, so the previous chapter. The event which started all of this: Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become an abomination to the Philistines, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost. The attack which helped Israel to gain ground against their oppressors, the attack which was so provoking that immobilized the entire Philistine army to go to battle in response, came at the hands of the prince, Jonathan. When Jonathan attacks the Philistine outpost with his armor-bearer, it isn't the first time he's done something like this. Valiant moves seem to be a habit with him. But what does Saul do? He has the trumpets blown through Israel's land. He says, "Let the Hebrews hear. Saul has attacked the Philistines." Firstly, Saul takes credit for Jonathan's triumph. Secondly, he makes sure to announce it to everyone, having the trumpets blown in honor of a victory that he wasn't a part of. And then, as we know, when things started to go south and the threat seemed too much, Saul doesn't lead the people who have gathered to him. He doesn't rally the troops, exhibit courage in the face of danger. He withdraws. He goes and sits under a pomegranate tree. And in fact, it's not just in any old town that he stays in the outskirts of. Saul is a Benjamite from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was specifically from the town of Gibeah. He's literally gone back home, sitting on the outskirts of his hometown, surrounding himself with trinkets and symbols he hopes will change the situation for him. And then even when the situation turns in his favor and victories within his grasp, he responds by hesitating, waiting, looking for further signs and crutches. We said that this story is the story of two different types of leadership and what motivates them. On the one hand, we have the leadership portrayed in Prince Jonathan. He has been watching his father sit under that pomegranate tree, watching while the Philistines take more and more territory, and he concludes, I can't sit around and do nothing about this. He decides to do something. Jonathan's leadership looks like this. He is brave and courageous, even at risk to himself. Like we said, he has taken courageous steps repeatedly. He's a man of action, not meaning being reckless or foolish, acting without thinking, but if something needs to be done, he gets up and attempts to do it, not talking endlessly about it, but actually moving. Jonathan acts even under imperfect conditions. He doesn't sit around waiting for the stars and the moon to align. He sees that waiting for perfect conditions is not always wise or possible. Fourthly, Jonathan puts himself in the firing line. He could have commanded 10 of his men to go over to the outpost and attack it for him. After all, he's the prince. But if there's a risk to take, he's willing to lead the charge, to put himself on the line, to go himself, not hiding behind the title of prince. Jonathan is a creative problem solver. He thought outside the box about how to approach the enemy in an unexpected and some might say mad way. Number 6, Jonathan acts even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. We see this in how he expresses his reasoning to his armor-bearer. Perhaps God will give us victory. He's saying, I'm going to go do this. I know it's not God's will for our people to be further oppressed or overwhelmed by the Philistines, and so I'm going to go act on that understanding. And maybe God will add to what I'm doing. Number 7, Jonathan knew when it's time to not have a discussion about something he intended to do. He didn't consult his father before going. In fact, he deliberately steals away unnoticed. Sometimes it's not the time to have a debate, to take a survey, to have a vote. Now, this in no way means that good leadership equals tyranny, poor communication, or not listening to others. But it does mean that sometimes the wise choice is not waiting around for the approval and go-ahead of others that may end up hindering you from doing the right thing. Sometimes you must act alone. Jonathan is willing to act against the odds. Him and his armor-bearer were outnumbered. We looked at how they approached the enemy from a position of disadvantage, both geographically and because they only had one sword. Number 9, Jonathan inspires trust in those he leads. Being a leader is not merely due to his hereditary royal title. His young armor-bearer would not have charged into such an impossible situation without a sword and responded with language of passion and devotion if he did not trust Jonathan. If Jonathan had not proved himself to be a wise and trustworthy leader, someone who has inspired those he leads, someone you want to follow into the breach, someone you'd follow into death. Jonathan's priorities are not ego and image. He is clearly not bothered about making sure he gets the credit for everything he does. He doesn't stop in the middle of a battle to correct the information that Saul shared, that it was the king and not the prince who had attacked the Philistines. Jonathan's focus is on the well-being of his people, on everyone winning, on their liberation and safety, That's what was important to him. He goes off and does daring, heroic acts without an audience. The only other person there is his armor-bearer. He's not performing for anyone. He's doing it because he's leading, and he's got his eye on what is actually important. Which means Jonathan is also humble. He isn't motivated by pride or other people's praise. Jonathan is not a people pleaser. Again, he's willing to do things his father would likely not be happy about, and he's not consulting the popularity polls to help him decide his actions, meaning Jonathan is a secure leader, secure in himself and what he believes. And finally, Jonathan is motivated by faith. He acted in trust that even if the odds were stacked against them, that there was a chance that God would help. He's okay with working behind the scenes, in the shadows, because he knows that God sees him. God sees his efforts. Now we can compare Jonathan's leadership to his father Saul's leadership. What kind of leader, what kind of king was King Saul? Firstly, Saul was often cowardly and his actions dictated by fear. He was a man not of action nor of clear thought. He sat around waiting for something to happen, talking endlessly about it or ruminating and brooding. Saul in this story and others seems to wait for the perfect conditions before he'll move. Although Saul is a leader of the army, he eagerly employs others to do the work for him. This is exemplified later on when he permits a young boy called David to fight a Philistine warrior on behalf of Israel. And the final verse of chapter 14 concludes with the words, "There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself." Under such circumstances, this may seem like being a good entrepreneur and a delegator, but sometimes leaders who surround themselves with able and brave people do this as compensation for their own lack of courage, and then perhaps take credit for something they have not done. Number 5, Saul quickly retreats from engaging in complex problems. When the situation is not in his favor and the odds are stacked against him, he sort of just gives up and goes away to sulk in a corner. Saul doesn't act when the outcome isn't clear or guaranteed. He wants the easy wins and simply stops leading when there's a chance of defeat or difficulty. And even when the outcome seems promised, he still dithers and waffles around. He's a leader terrified of being seen as making a mistake or suffering defeat. Next on the list, Saul almost obsessively, when it suits him, discusses the task ahead. With priests and judges, people around him. There's a saying that goes, the less you intend on doing something, the more you have to keep talking about it. Perhaps some of us are very well familiar with this tactic in some of our politicians. Again, Saul's decisions are a slave to the numbers of probability of success. He rarely acts unless the winds are blowing in his favor. Saul doesn't inspire trust in those he leads. Many of his men fled the battle scene when soldiers must stand even when under threat. And no wonder. Even their king retreats to sit under a tree, not exactly inspiring confidence. Saul is ruled by pride and ego, his fixation on his public image, how he is viewed by the people, public opinion, his story is what matters the most to him. Not what things are, but how things look. He wants to be admired, to be seen as a great leader, and the truth is, he could be, He could be. But obsessing about wanting to seem like one actually ends up repeatedly getting in the way of him actually being a good leader. Saul is in love with his own legend, a passionate self-promoter, and feverishly trying to control how people perceive him. Thus Saul rises and falls with the praise of others, leading to both paranoia and great insecurity. Saul is a flagrant people-pleaser. This is very much a result of the previous point. The desperation to be liked makes him a slave to public opinion, meaning he must constantly check in with what others think of him, instead of checking with what sort of person he wants to be, what his values are, or what God's values are. This again makes him a deeply insecure leader. And finally, Saul is clearly not motivated by faith. He treats the articles of his religion as a lucky rabbit's foot. He's not concerned about having an actual relationship or connection with God. He treats faith like boxes to be ticked. Have I consulted a priest? Tick. Have I made a sacrifice? Tick. Have I brought the Ark of the Covenant here? Tick. Saul's faith is performative, not genuine. It's about putting on a show and the exhibition of it all. Just like his leadership, it's all about performance and perception. All his world is a stage. So, what can we take away from this story in 1 Samuel chapter 14, and how can it inspire us in our own lives? Well, firstly, it can remind us that in many things, somebody has to go first. Somebody has to be the first to do some things. Someone has to lead the way or be a pioneer of sorts. Somebody has to try something new that hasn't been done before or isn't currently being done. This takes boldness and imagination, because you must be able to imagine things that are not currently there, to have a vision, to be willing to forge a path that isn't yet on the map, and that can be scary and lonely. It's not always fun to go first. This little precedent, little backup, not a beaten track, and often much opposition, messaging like it's impossible and it's never been done, hanging over you like a cloud of doom. But the most beautiful, liberating, healing things on this planet have often been brought about by people willing to do things that few others were. Whether that was insisting on the civil rights of a marginalized group that the majority of society refused to even recognize as fully human, or one person breaking a damaging family cycle and making sure it stops with them, even though that cycle has been upheld by generations. Or people who genuinely wish to follow Jesus and see that this is no longer possible to do under the banner of their current religion, political affiliation, or religious group. We can, in big and small ways, decide to take steps in the right direction, to take the initiative to do the right things even when no one else or very few others are. A second thing we can take away from this story is that when one person leads well and does something right, they won't always be alone. Right and just action can inspire right and just action. Not necessarily in great numbers and not always affecting the majority, but courage gives birth to courage. Jonathan had an idea and he chose to pursue it. He would have probably done it even if no one went with him, but somebody did. Jonathan's bravery inspired this young armor-bearer. Our bravery can also inspire others. Sometimes you just have to go and do it. If you're lucky, you may be joined by someone who believes in you or trusts in you or in your cause, and other times you may need to go alone. Thirdly, you are more than your role or your title. Even if you feel you have a role or job or position in life that seems as pointless as being an armor-bearer in Israel in those days, what you do and the person you choose to be truly matters. You can have a big impact in ways you sometimes can't foresee. Jonathan's armor-bearer may not have had his arms full of weapons to carry, but he still helped his prince. He still did his part. He was loyal and encouraging. He made sure Jonathan didn't have to go there alone. He exhibited as much bravery as his master. No title or position can render your voice and choices unimportant. You are, by fact, important. A fourth point we can take away is that God makes good things grow. He multiplies good things, be they courage, justice, generosity, patience. When we join in what He's doing, and where we're going is actually according to His will, even if our efforts amount to a seemingly small effect, He magnifies that effect. Maybe in unexpected ways, or ways we won't see straight away, or ways that we will never see in this age, He still makes them grow. Jonathan and his armor-bearer attacked one garrison. God sent ripple effects through the entire enemy army. Do what you can when you can, and don't worry about being few in numbers. Keeping in mind that it's not all on you. The greater victory is not in your hands, but you can ask God to have the last word. And the efforts and the brave choices that you make are not unseen and will be multiplied. Our fifth takeaway is a bit different. It's an anti-takeaway, if you will. Something which we should not be extrapolating from this story. The point of this story is not throw yourself headlong into every stupid and reckless idea which comes to your mind. This story isn't about promoting irresponsibility, putting yourself in needless danger, or anything like that. Sometimes the want to act bravely in faith has led people to all sorts of misinformed conclusions, like that they should go and sell all their belongings tomorrow because God will provide, or thinking that self-denial to the point of destitution is the kind of courage we're called to. But that is simply not the point. It's not about being foolish or inviting self-destruction. That's not faith, and that's not trust in God. Jonathan trusted that God wanted for his people what He said He wanted for His people: peace, safety, belonging, justice, freedom, rest. This is what Jonathan was acting on. If our actions lead to our needless harm, then we're assuming God desires our needless harm, and that simply isn't the case. So the point is not go do everything which comes into your mind. It's what comes into your mind that is wise, good, and according to God's will. Go do that. And our last and final point, which is such an important one. Don't wait around for your leaders. Don't wait around for your elders, those in power or authority, to move, to do the right thing, or to lead. Don't wait around for them. If you know you can do something to help ease the suffering of someone in this world, don't wait around for someone else to do it first. If you are safely able to, if you are inspired to show kindness, don't be dependent on someone setting the precedent for you. You don't have to wait for the approval or the go-ahead of your king, your politicians, your government, your pastor, your parents, your teachers, your youth leaders, your spouse, your friends, to take steps in the right direction before you do. Don't wait for your elders to start challenging racist thinking. Don't wait for your parents to approve of healthier relationships and boundary setting. Don't wait for the pastor to be more inclusive of people in your society. Don't wait for men at your company to treat women with equity. Don't wait for your social media feed to show defending immigrants as being trendy. Don't wait for your peers to agree with how to spend time more wisely. Don't wait for the medical community to become more trauma-informed. Don't wait. Tread the right path, whether it is popular or not. Jonathan didn't ask his father for permission, nor did he wait to go get the whole army on board with his idea. He knew that it was right to go. He knew he could do something, and he went. Sometimes we, like Saul, sit around, surrounding ourselves with the trappings of our faith and waiting for God to do something. Sometimes waiting is right. But if God has already made clear he doesn't want human beings to be oppressed or suffer, then what are we waiting for? Because God, if we listen closely, he's off in the distance, busy fighting battles and doing what he's doing, while we sit still and wait and don't go join him. May your heart be inspired to courageous love and brave action. May you have the wisdom to not confuse insightful judgment with fear. May you be more focused on what you do, whether there's an audience or not, than protecting and fashioning your public image. May God assure you that it doesn't matter what your age is, your position, your title, your sphere of influence, your ethnicity, others' opinions of you, your experience, your job, your resources or lack thereof. You can still be led by God, and you can still do what you have in your mind, just like Jonathan and his armor-bearer.